So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. As Brittany mentioned, my name is Taylor Tornalicki. I'm the statistician for the DC Sentencing Commission, and I'm here tonight to share some highlights with you from this year's annual report. So the report comes out every April, and it showcases the Commission's accomplishments over the past year, and also has a very big chapter about adult felony sentencing trends, and that is what we will be sharing with you all tonight. So starting with the very basics, this chart shows the historical trends of the number of counts, cases, and individuals sentenced each year. Something I immediately want to point out is that the extreme decrease in 2020, followed by the rapid increases in 2021 and 2022, are largely attributed to the pandemic and its impact on DC Superior Court. Something we all know and are very familiar with, but still important to remember when looking at historical trends. But in 2023, we actually see a decrease in the number of counts, cases, and individuals sentenced. And what's interesting about this is that the trends that we saw last year followed the trajectory of what we were seeing pre-pandemic, which is a gradual decline in all three of these metrics. So just to give you some specific data points, there was a 3% reduction in counts when compared to 2019, and a 12% decrease in both the number of cases and individuals sentenced. This suggests that the court has returned to its pre-pandemic operating status, which is a reoccurring theme that you'll see throughout this presentation, as a lot of the trends that we saw in 2023 align with what we saw back in 2019. So moving into case disposition, this chart shows the distribution of disposition type. So whether the case was resolved through a plea agreement, a jury trial, or a bench trial. In 2023, we saw an increase in the proportion of jury trials. 6.6% of all cases sentenced last year were disposed through a jury trial, which is the greatest rate that we have seen since 2015. This increase was offset by a decrease in the number of plea agreements, which dropped from 97% to 92%. Again, this suggests that the court has returned to its normal operations, as this 92% rate of plea agreements is consistent with pre-pandemic levels. Specifically, between 2014 and 2019, an average of 92% of cases were resolved through a plea agreement, which is exactly what we saw in 2023. So next, looking at sentence type distribution. One of the more interesting findings in this year's report is the shift in probation and prison sentences when compared to previous years. So last year in 2023, 69% of all felony counts resulted in a prison sentence, while only 15% received a probation sentence. And what's notable about this finding is that this is the greatest rate of prison sentences and the lowest rate of probation sentences that we have seen since 2014. When we compare 2023 to 2022, both prison and probation fluctuated by 12%, with prison increasing by 12% and probation decreasing by 12%. Short split sentences have remained very consistent over time, averaging at 18% of all sentences each year. So something new we added to this year's report was a deeper dive into the sentence type trends. And the master grid, which is shown here, provides judges with the recommended sentence that is based off the offense of conviction and the criminal history score of the individual being sentenced. So different colors represent different sentencing options, where white boxes are prison only, green boxes are short split in prison, and yellow boxes are probation short split in prison. And something I do want to emphasize is that prison is an available sentencing option in every single box. So this chart shows the distribution of sentence type in each colored section of the sentencing guidelines master grid. And what I think is really important about this analysis, and what is often a misconception about the guidelines, is that just because someone falls in a probation eligible box does not mean that they're going to get a probation sentence. So if you look at the far right column of this chart, which represents the yellow probation eligible boxes, you'll see that only 30% of these sentences resulted in a probation sentence. 30% received a short split and 40% received a prison sentence. So when combined, this means that the majority of people in a probation eligible box ended up being sentenced to either prison or short split, not probation. The same is true for short split, where 80% of those in the green boxes received a prison sentence. So the big takeaway from this finding is that the color of the box on the master grid does not necessarily determine the sentence that is going to be imposed. So next is an analysis on offense severity groups, and every felony offense is ranked into a severity group. On the master grid, the most serious offenses are ranked in group M1, and the least severe offenses are ranked in group M9. And the drug grid is similar, with the most serious drug offenses in group D1 and the less severe drug offenses in group D4. So the gradient colors in this chart show that most sentences last year were for offenses that were ranked in group M8. Over half, 56% of all felony sentences were for an M8 offense, which is pretty consistent with historical trends. We do see a pretty big shift in between 2018 and 2019, which is when the commission re-ranked felon in possession from M7 to M8. So with that, we did see an increase in M8 sentences, as felon in possession is one of the most frequently sentenced offenses. We also aggregated the offense severity groups to show the number of sentences imposed in different regions of the grid. So offense severity groups 1 through 5 on the master grid represented 18% of all felony sentences in 2023, and that's compared to only 11.8% in 2022. So this shift in these higher severity offense categories aligns with the 12% increase in prison sentences also observed this past year, as prison is the only available sentencing option in these top 5 offense severity groups. So this pie chart shows the breakdown of counts sentenced in 2023 by offense type. Violent and weapon offenses were the two most frequently sentenced and represented about 75% of all felony counts when combined. Drug offenses only represented 4.7% of all counts, rounded up to 5% on this chart. But this is another key finding, as it is the lowest proportion of drug sentences ever observed by the commission in a given year. So now I'm going to hone in on the sentencing trends for weapon offenses, as it is our top offense category. Specifically looking at the trends for the two most frequently sentenced weapons offenses, which are carrying a pistol without a license and felon in possession. So CPWL was the top weapon offense, representing 42% of all weapons counts and 18% of all felony counts sentenced last year. Felon in possession represented 34% of all weapon offenses and 14% of all felony counts. So combined, these two gun possession offenses accounted for about 1/3 of all felony sentences in 2023. And this chart shows the distribution of sentence type for both offenses. So we see a somewhat uniform distribution for CPWL, though most counts did receive a probation sentence. But on the other hand, felon in possession has a 1-year mandatory minimum, so it's not surprising to see that the vast majority of these counts did receive a prison sentence. We also monitor sentencing trends for homicide offenses, and like overall trends, the sharp decreases in 2020 and 2021 are largely due to the COVID-19 pandemic, though we did see significant increases over the last 2 years that are more consistent with pre-pandemic trends. So there were 84 homicide counts sentenced in 2023, which is the exact same number that was reported in 2019, again suggesting a return to normal operations. Now moving into guidelines compliance. So this year, 98.6% of all felony sentences were compliant with the guidelines, which demonstrates a very strong acceptance of the guidelines by the court. And this table shows overall historic compliance trends, which, as you can see, have been very consistent at or above 97% for the last several years. And now moving into the arrest to sentencing analysis, which is one of the newer additions to the annual report. But before I get into the data, I do want to go over the methodology used for this type of analysis. So the arrest to sentencing analysis is what we do to track a case from its initial arrest all the way through final disposition and sentencing. Like all of the other analyses produced by the Commission, we're looking at adult arrests in cases only. Juveniles are not included in any of the Commission's data. A big component of this analysis is the papering rate. And the way the Commission determines whether an arrest has been papered, meaning that it has been filed in DC Superior Court, is by matching the arrest number that is provided by the Metropolitan Police Department to the arrest number in the data that we get from the court. If the MPD arrest number is also present in the court's data, then the arrest is marked as papered, and if it's not, then it's marked as no papered. There are some limitations with this, the biggest of which is that we are not capturing any arrests where charges are not immediately filed after an arrest is made. The second limitation is that we do not include any charges that are brought to U.S. District Court, and the main reason for that is that we just do not get District Court data. So when an arrest is papered, it generates a case in DC Superior Court. So we also look at the disposition of those cases to better understand what happens after an arrest actually makes it into court. However, because a single arrest can result in multiple cases or can result in fugitive cases only, and those cases are omitted from this arrest to sentencing analysis, the number of papered arrests will rarely exactly match the number of filed cases. So that's the methodology getting into the data. Last year, there were 5,319 adult felony arrests made in DC. About 2/3 of these arrests were papered, generating a total of 3,489 non-fugitive cases that were filed in DC Superior Court. The disposition outcomes are up to date as of January 10th, 2024, which is when we took the snapshot for the 2023 annual report data. So as of January this year, 20% of these cases were closed without conviction, 32% resulted in a finding of guilt for any criminal offense, felony or misdemeanor, and just under half are still pending disposition. And this table shows the arrest to sentencing trends over the last 5 years, where the case disposition trends were updated using 2023 data. So here we see that papering rates have been gradually declining from 72% in 2018 to 54% in 2022. Though in 2023, we did see the first increase in papering rates during the 6-year time period, where 66% of all felony arrests were filed in DC Superior Court. I already went over the trends for 2023, but I think it's worth talking about the updated numbers from previous years as well. So for example, when we did this analysis in last year's report, 44% of the 2022 arrests were still pending disposition. Though when looking at these cases a full year later, the proportion of pending cases has dropped to 12%, and that is offset by increases in both cases that were closed without conviction and those that resulted in a finding of guilt. And then generally speaking, just under half of all cases filed from papered arrests since 2018 resulted in a conviction for any criminal offense. 40% were closed without conviction and 12% are still pending disposition. And we continue to monitor these trends as cases continue to progress through the justice system. So we will have updated data on this towards the end of this year. So that concludes this presentation on this year's annual report. This was just a very high-level overview of some of the key findings of the 2023 sentencing trends. And if you haven't already, I definitely recommend that you read the full report. It's a bit long. I think it's like 90 pages or so. But there's a lot of interesting information in there, not just about sentencing trends, but also about the work that the commission has been working on over the past year or so. So thank you for joining us all this evening, and I think we can now open the floor for any questions or discussion.